Ladies and gentlemen, the 1930s were a defining period in American history, a time of immense struggle, uncertainty, and desperation. The Great Depression gripped the nation, sending shockwaves through every aspect of daily life. What had once been a land of opportunity and prosperity became a place of financial ruin. The stock market crash of 1929 had shattered businesses, wiped out personal savings, and left countless families with nothing. Banks closed their doors, taking the last dollars of hardworking citizens with them, and soon, long lines formed outside soup kitchens, where the unlucky hoped for a warm meal. Unemployment reached record levels, leaving men and women with few choices to survive. Factories shut down, farms failed, and homes were lost. For the first time in modern history, millions of Americans found themselves with no job, no money, and no future. Cities swelled with the homeless and Hoovervilles, makeshift shantytowns named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the crisis, spread across the country. It was during this time that people began to question the institutions that had promised them stability. Banks, which had once symbolized security, were now seen as the enemy. They had foreclosed on homes, seized farmland, and turned hardworking families into beggars overnight. The government struggled to provide relief, and for many, there was little hope on the horizon. The desperation of the era gave rise to an undercurrent of rebellion. Some sought to fight back against the system they believed had failed them. Others turned to crime, not just out of greed, but out of sheer necessity. This was the backdrop against which a new kind of figure emerged, the outlaw. These were men who took matters into their own hands, striking at the very institutions that had ruined so many lives. Some saw them as criminals, dangerous and reckless. Others, however, saw them as symbols of defiance, people who did what many wished they could do themselves. In a time when the law seemed to protect only the wealthy, these figures captured the imagination of the public, becoming legends in their own right. The Great Depression was more than just an economic collapse. It was a turning point in American history. It reshaped the way people viewed wealth, justice, and survival. It created an environment where desperation drove men to extreme actions and where outlaws could become household names. This was an era where heroes and villains blurred together, and where the line between right and wrong was noticed. The Great Depression deepened. The social fabric of America began to fray. People were desperate, hungry, and angry. Many had done everything right, worked hard, saved money, provided for their families, only to watch their livelihoods vanish overnight. The banks that once held their life savings were closing down, businesses were shutting their doors, and even those who still had jobs were struggling to make ends meet. The sense of security that had once defined the American dream was now just a memory. With trust in the financial system at an all-time low, frustration and resentment grew. The wealthy seemed untouched by the crisis, while ordinary people bore the brunt of economic failure. Banks, seen as symbols of greed and corruption, became targets of public outrage. In this environment of suffering and uncertainty, crime rates surged. For some, stealing was the only way to put food on the table. For others, breaking the law was a form of rebellion against a system they believed had abandoned them. It was during this time that a new breed of criminals emerged, outlaws who weren't just thieves but larger-than-life figures. They didn't operate in the shadows like traditional criminals. Instead, they carried out bold, public acts that captured the imagination of the people. These outlaws weren't just robbing individuals. They were robbing banks, financial institutions, and the very symbols of a system that had failed so many. The newspapers played a major role in shaping how these figures were perceived. Sensational headlines turned them into national celebrities. They were given nicknames, their exploits were exaggerated, and in some cases, they were even portrayed as folk heroes. Many Americans struggling to survive saw them as symbols of defiance, people who stood up to a corrupt system, even if they did so through illegal means. Law enforcement, of course, saw things differently. To them, these outlaws were dangerous criminals who posed a serious threat to public order. They were reckless, violent, and willing to do whatever it took to evade capture. As their crimes became more brazen, authorities increased their efforts to track them down. What followed was a high-stakes battle between lawmen and criminals, one that played out not just in dusty bank lobbies and back alleys, but also in the headlines of every major newspaper across the country. The rise of outlaws in the 1930s wasn't just about crime, it was about a shifting society. It was about ordinary people questioning who the real criminals were, the men with guns robbing banks or the men in suits who had ruined lives without ever breaking a law. This was an era where the line between justice and vengeance blurred, and where criminals, for better or worse, became legends. Always so clear. In the midst of the chaos and desperation of the 1930s, one figure rose to national infamy. His name spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones in small-town diners and shouted across the front pages of the biggest newspapers in the country. He wasn't just another criminal, he was something different. His actions, bold and calculated, placed him in a category all his own. He came from humble beginnings, born into an America that was still finding its place in the world. Like many young men of his time, he had dreams of a better life, but circumstances led him down a path far removed from the traditional American ideal. The economic struggles of the Great Depression shaped him just as they shaped the rest of the country. But while some suffered in silence, he chose action. An action that would put him on a collision course with the law and make him one of the most infamous names of his time. He didn't operate like a common street thug. He wasn't just looking for a quick score or a petty crime to get by. No, he had bigger ambitions. His targets were the institutions that controlled money, the very banks that had taken everything from struggling families. He walked into these places not with fear, but with an air of confidence, as if he belonged there, as if he had every right to take what he came for. And time after time, he walked out with bags of cash, slipping through the fingers of law enforcement as if he were untouchable. It wasn't just what he did, it was how he did it. He planned his heists with precision, studying his targets, anticipating law enforcement movements, and surrounding himself with individuals who shared his vision. He moved quickly, in and out before authorities had time to react, using clever tactics that left even the best detectives struggling to keep up. On more than one occasion, he left lawmen humiliated, escaping from impossible situations and making them look powerless in the face of his audacity. Despite the serious nature of his crimes, there were those who admired him. In the eyes of some, he wasn't just a criminal, he was a man taking on a corrupt system. He wasn't stealing from the poor or terrorizing innocent people. He was robbing banks, the very institutions that had foreclosed on homes and destroyed lives. And in doing so, he became something more than a thief. He became a legend. But law enforcement saw him for what he was, a dangerous criminal who had to be stopped. As his reputation grew, so did the determination of the authorities to bring him down. He wasn't just a problem for local police. His name reached the highest levels of law enforcement, and soon, the government itself took a personal interest in ending his reign. What followed was one of the most relentless pursuits in American history, a chase that gripped the nation and kept people on the edge of their seats. The more he evaded capture, the larger his legend became. He became the subject of speculation, rumor, and myth. Some claimed he had a charm that made people protect him, that ordinary citizens were willing to look the other way when he passed through their towns. Others believed he was simply too clever, always one step ahead of those trying to catch him. Whether seen as a folk hero or a menace to society, one thing was certain. He had become one of the most notorious figures of his time, a time when hardship and suffering dominated daily life. The American people found themselves captivated by a figure unlike any other. He was a man who defied the law, outwitted the authorities, and carried out daring crimes that seemed almost theatrical in nature. His name was spoken in homes across the country, from working-class families struggling to put food on the table to the wealthy who read about him in the newspapers over morning coffee. Whether they saw him as a ruthless criminal or a rebellious anti-hero, one thing was undeniable. He had captured the nation's attention like few had before. The media played a pivotal role in shaping his image. Newspapers ran bold headlines detailing his latest heists, escapes, and confrontations with law enforcement. Reporters fed the public's hunger for stories about him, sometimes embellishing details to make his exploits seem even more daring. Some articles painted him as a menace, a lawless bandit who needed to be brought to justice. Others, however, portrayed him as a sort of modern-day Robin Hood, a man who struck back at a corrupt system that had left so many in ruin. It was this contrast in perception that made him such a fascinating figure. To law enforcement and government officials, he was a dangerous criminal whose actions could not be tolerated. To the banks he targeted, he was a walking nightmare, a symbol of chaos and defiance. But to ordinary Americans who had lost everything during the Great Depression, he was something else entirely. Many saw him as a man who took from the rich, from the institutions that had failed the people, and in doing so, he became a figure they could secretly root for. His public image was further fueled by the way he carried himself. He was not the typical outlaw hiding in the shadows. He had a boldness about him, a confidence that made his actions seem almost effortless. Reports often described him as charming, with a magnetic personality that allowed him to win people over, even as he broke the law. There were even stories of him being polite to bank customers during his robberies, reassuring them that he wasn't there to harm them, only to take what he believed was rightfully his. These details, whether entirely true or exaggerated by the press, only added to his legend. Even as law enforcement tightened its grip, the public remained enthralled. Every escape, every close call, every near capture only heightened the drama. People followed his story like an unfolding novel, wondering where he would strike next, how he would evade capture once more. Some secretly cheered for him, while others condemned him, but no one could ignore him. This was a time when America was desperate for stories of resilience, of individuals who stood against impossible odds. And whether he was seen as a hero or a villain, he embodied something larger than himself. He became a symbol of defiance, a reflection of a society grappling with its own disillusionment. His story was more than just crime. It was about power, justice, and a nation searching for something to believe in. What set this man apart from so many others of his time was not just the fact that he was a criminal, but the way he carried out his crimes. He wasn't just another outlaw looking for a quick payday. He was calculated, methodical, and fearless. His robberies weren't chaotic, unplanned acts of desperation. They were executed with precision, almost like a military operation. He studied his targets carefully, knowing every detail about the banks he planned to hit before he even walked through the doors. When he struck, he did so with confidence. Witnesses often described him as calm, as if he belonged there, as if robbing banks was just another day's work. He moved quickly, wasting no time, and always seemed to be in control of the situation. Unlike the image of a reckless bandit waving a gun wildly, he was known for his smooth, almost professional approach. He and his gang would storm into a bank, take only what they needed, and disappear before law enforcement could react. In many cases, it was over in minutes. One of his most famous tactics was the way he handled crowds during a robbery. Unlike other criminals of his time, who instilled fear in their victims, he often reassured the people in the bank that they were not in danger. He was known to tell bank customers that he wasn't there for their money, only the bank's. Some reports even claimed that he would joke with hostages, making light conversation as if they were all just part of a routine transaction. This strange blend of charm and audacity only added to the legend that surrounded him. But his boldness was not limited to just the banks he robbed. It extended to his ability to evade capture. Law enforcement officers across multiple states were hunting him, but he always seemed to be one step ahead. He had an uncanny ability to slip through police blockades, escape tight situations, and vanish into the shadows just when authorities thought they had him cornered. One of his most daring acts was his escape from jail, a feat that solidified his reputation as not just a criminal, but a master escape artist. He didn't just break out. He did it in a way that left the public in awe and law enforcement humiliated. Reports of the escape spread like wildfire, with newspapers printing every possible detail. Some people couldn't believe it had happened, while others saw it as yet another example of his ability to outthink those trying to catch him. His ability to avoid capture wasn't just about luck, it was about strategy. He constantly changed locations, never staying in one place too long. He relied on a network of safe houses and associates who were willing to help him. He even changed his appearance when necessary, blending into crowds and moving through towns without drawing attention. Despite the growing efforts of law enforcement to bring him down, he continued his crime spree, robbing banks, escaping tight situations, and evading authorities with a confidence that few had ever seen before. Each successful heist and narrow escape only fueled the fascination surrounding him. The public watched in anticipation, lawmen grew more desperate, and his legend grew with each passing day. The 1930s were not just the era of the Great Depression and daring criminals, it was also the golden age of sensational journalism. Newspapers were the primary source of news, and competition among publishers was fierce. Headlines had to be bold, gripping, and attention-grabbing to sell copies. This created the perfect storm for someone like him. His exploits were the kind of real-life drama that newspapers thrived on, and the press turned him from an outlaw into a larger-than-life figure. From the moment he began his string of daring heists, the media latched onto his story. Every robbery, every police chase, and every narrow escape became front-page news. His name was printed in bold letters across newspapers nationwide. Readers followed his exploits as if they were reading the latest chapter in an action-packed novel. The public, hungry for distraction from the economic despair that surrounded them, became engrossed in the unfolding drama. The newspapers didn't just report on his crimes, they crafted a narrative. Some publications portrayed him as a ruthless gangster, a dangerous criminal who needed to be stopped at all costs. They described him as reckless, violent, and a threat to society. Others, however, took a different approach. They painted him as a charismatic outlaw, a man taking on the very institutions that had failed so many. They emphasized his daring nature, his ability to outsmart the police, and his seemingly fearless attitude. Photographs of him, often taken from old mugshots or court records, were plastered across newspapers and wanted posters. Some images made him look menacing, while others captured a youthful charm that added to his mystique. The contrast in media portrayals created a divide in public opinion. Was he a dangerous menace or a folk hero? The answer depended on which newspaper you were reading. The way the media covered his crimes also had a profound impact on law enforcement. His growing notoriety put pressure on authorities to capture him as quickly as possible. The headlines made the police look incompetent every time he escaped. Each failed attempt to arrest him only made his legend grow stronger. In some cases, law enforcement had to hold press conferences just to reassure the public that they were still in pursuit, though it often seemed like he was always one step ahead. His name became so well known that even people who had never seen him felt like they knew him. Stories of his exploits spread by word of mouth, and with each retelling, the details grew more dramatic. Some claimed he was invincible, that he had a supernatural ability to escape danger. Others believed he had connections so deep that even the authorities couldn't touch him. Myths and rumors surrounded him, blurring the lines between truth and fiction. Perhaps one of the greatest ironies of his story is that the very media that made him famous also contributed to his downfall. With his face so well known, it became harder for him to move unnoticed. People recognized him in public, and informants, some motivated by reward money, others by fear, began feeding information to the police. The newspapers that once glorified his daring escapes eventually became the very instruments that helped authorities track him down. But while law enforcement worked tirelessly to put an end to his crime spree, the press ensured that his story would never be forgotten. Even after his time had passed, the media continued to tell his tale, cementing his place in American history. His life, shaped by headlines and sensationalized stories, became the foundation for books, movies, and endless retellings of the legend that he had unwittingly helped to create. As his notoriety grew, so did the determination of law enforcement to bring him to justice. What had started as a series of daring bank robberies had now escalated into a nationwide manhunt. He was no longer just a criminal. He was a public enemy, and the authorities could not afford to let him continue evading capture. Every successful heist, every daring escape, and every bold act of defiance against the law only intensified the resolve of those hunting him. Local police forces had tried and failed to stop him. His ability to slip through their grasp had become almost legendary, leaving many officers frustrated and embarrassed. But as his reputation spread beyond state lines, the chase became bigger than just a few local sheriffs trying to track down a fugitive. The federal government got involved, and with that, the stakes became even higher. The newly strengthened federal agencies saw him as a direct challenge to their authority. His crimes were making headlines across the country, and each escape from justice was seen as a failure on the part of law enforcement. He was making them look weak, and they could not allow that to continue. A task force was assembled, composed of some of the best agents in the country, men who had been given a clear directive: capture him at all costs. The manhunt was unlike anything seen before. Agents scoured every lead, interrogated associates, and tracked down anyone who had ever come into contact with him. Safe houses were raided, informants were recruited, and surveillance was heightened. Rewards were offered for any information leading to his capture, and the public was urged to come forward if they spotted him. Every roadblock, every checkpoint, every tip was another step in tightening the noose around him. Despite their efforts, he remained elusive. He had an uncanny ability to disappear just when they thought they had him cornered. He changed hideouts frequently, moving between states and relying on trusted connections to keep him safe. He altered his appearance, blending into crowds, slipping away before authorities could close in. He seemed almost untouchable, as if he was always one step ahead. But law enforcement refused to give up. The more he evaded capture, the more determined they became. His legend was growing too large, his defiance too bold. He wasn't just another criminal anymore. He had become a symbol, and symbols had to be destroyed to restore order. The chase intensified, resources were doubled, and agents pursued him with a relentless focus. The pressure mounted. He was running out of places to hide. The authorities were closing in, and he knew that every move he made was being watched. His once loyal network began to crumble under the weight of fear and reward money. Those who had once protected him began to distance themselves, unwilling to risk their own safety for a man who had become too famous, too hunted. The walls were closing in. He was no longer the untouchable outlaw who could vanish into the night. Law enforcement was closing the gaps, cutting off his escape routes, and making it clear that there was no way out. The chase that had once been a thrilling game of cat and mouse was reaching its inevitable climax. And with each passing day, the net drew tighter around him, setting the stage for a final, dramatic confrontation. As the relentless pursuit entered its final stages, the man who had once seemed untouchable found himself with fewer and fewer places to hide. His boldness, which had once been his greatest asset, had now become his greatest liability. He was too well known, his face plastered on wanted posters, newspapers, and law enforcement bulletins across the country. The net was tightening, and the walls were closing in. He had spent years outsmarting the authorities, vanishing just when they thought they had him cornered. He had slipped through roadblocks, evaded traps, and even walked out of a jail that was supposed to be inescapable. But law enforcement had learned from their failures. They had studied his methods, anticipated his next moves, and refined their strategy. The task force assigned to bring him down was no longer relying on luck. They were relying on calculated precision. His network of allies and accomplices had also started to break down. At the height of his criminal career, there had been no shortage of people willing to help him, friends, lovers, and underworld connections who admired his defiance of the law. But as the pressure from law enforcement increased, so did the risks of associating with him. The government had made it clear that anyone caught helping him would face severe consequences, and suddenly, people who once swore loyalty began to reconsider. Some turned informant, choosing to sell their knowledge of his movements in exchange for leniency or financial reward. Others, terrified of being implicated, cut ties and refused to offer him shelter. The safe houses that had once been open to him were now locked. The once reliable escape routes were now filled with agents watching his every move. The world that had once seemed so large and full of possibilities had shrunk to a few desperate hiding spots. Still, he refused to go down without a fight. He changed locations frequently, staying on the move, trying to stay ahead of those who were after him. He altered his appearance, hoping to blend in with crowds and avoid recognition. He avoided major cities, knowing that law enforcement had informants everywhere. But no matter how careful he was, the weight of his reputation followed him wherever he went. He had become a ghost of his former self. The man who once walked into banks with fearless confidence, who had laughed in the face of danger, now moved with caution, constantly looking over his shoulder. He knew that the odds were against him. He knew that the authorities were closing in. And yet, even as the final chase unfolded, he refused to surrender. The authorities had received a tip. Someone had seen him, someone who knew where he was hiding. Law enforcement wasted no time. They mobilized quickly, surrounding the area, making sure there was no way out. The manhunt that had lasted for years was now reaching its final act. The once unstoppable outlaw was now just a man, cornered and outnumbered. The world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. After years of daring heists, narrow escapes, and relentless pursuit, the moment that law enforcement had been waiting for had finally arrived. The man who had once seemed invincible was now cornered, his options dwindling by the second. What had begun as a high-stakes game of cat and mouse was now reaching its inevitable conclusion. The authorities were not just pursuing a fugitive anymore, they were determined to make an example out of him. His capture, or elimination, would send a clear message that no one, no matter how cunning, could defy the law forever. The final confrontation took place in a setting that seemed almost too ordinary for such a legendary figure. There were no blazing shootouts in the open countryside, no high-speed chases through the dusty roads of America. Instead, the end came in a place where he had hoped to blend into the crowd, to disappear among the everyday people who had once idolized him. But the eyes of the law were everywhere, and betrayal lurked closer than he had ever imagined. It was an informant who set the trap, someone close enough to know his movements, someone who saw an opportunity in turning him over to the authorities. The price on his head was too great, and the fear of being caught in his web of crime was too strong. The tip came in, swift and precise, and the authorities moved with surgical precision. Agents and officers were stationed strategically, closing off potential escape routes, ensuring that when the moment came, there would be no way out. The tension in the air was thick, as if the entire world had paused to witness the final act of a story that had captivated the nation. He was no stranger to close calls, but this time, the law had left nothing to chance. He stepped out, unaware of the noose tightening around him. The agents had been waiting, their eyes locked on him, their hands steady on their weapons. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. He had always lived on the edge, always been one step ahead. But this time, there was no clever escape, no last-minute trick. The inevitability of the moment was clear. The lawmen did not hesitate. Commands were shouted, weapons were drawn, and in the blink of an eye, the situation exploded into action. The people around him, innocent bystanders unaware of the storm about to break, scattered in panic. The air was filled with tension, the kind that comes just before something irreversible takes place. For him, there was no surrender. He had built his life on defiance, on never backing down, on always believing he could slip away one more time. Perhaps, in that final instant, he still thought he could. But the odds were against him. The world had changed, and the legend he had created could not protect him anymore. And then, in a burst of noise and motion, it happened though his time had come to an end. The story was far from over. In many ways, his death only added to the mystique that had surrounded him for years. The newspapers, which had followed his every move with breathless headlines, now had their final chapter. His demise was plastered across front pages nationwide, with dramatic retellings of his last moments, eyewitness accounts, and photographs capturing the scene where he had fallen. Some publications called it justice served, while others mourned the passing of an outlaw who had become larger than life. The public, too, was divided. Some saw him as nothing more than a criminal who had finally met his fate. To them, he was a lawbreaker who had spent years defying authority, stealing from banks, and leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. His death was an example of what happened to those who dared to challenge the law. But for others, he remained a symbol of rebellion, a man who had taken what he wanted in a time when so many had nothing. To those struggling through the Great Depression, he had been an antihero, a figure who had outwitted the very institutions they blamed for their suffering. In the days that followed, his name was spoken in hushed tones and lively debates alike. Songs were written about him, ballads that romanticized his daring exploits and painted him as a modern-day Robin Hood. Folk stories exaggerated his feats, making him seem almost superhuman, a man who had robbed banks with a smile, outsmarted the police at every turn, and charmed those who crossed his path. His legend grew beyond reality, shaped by the imaginations of those who longed for a hero, even if that hero had lived outside the law. Hollywood, never one to miss an opportunity, quickly turned his life into a cinematic spectacle. Movies portrayed him as a charismatic outlaw, a rogue who had lived fast and died young. Books were written about him, detailing his exploits with varying degrees of accuracy. His name became synonymous with the romanticized image of the American gangster, rebellious, fearless, and forever on the run. Historians, too, studied his life, attempting to separate fact from fiction. They analyzed the way he had captured the public's imagination, the media's role in shaping his image, and the way his story reflected the era in which he had lived. Some saw him as a product of the Great Depression, a time when faith in the system was at an all-time low and the idea of someone standing against the establishment, even as a criminal, held a certain allure. Others viewed him simply as a man who had chosen a life of crime and had paid the ultimate price for it. His personal belongings became artifacts of history. His weapons, his letters, even the clothes he had worn in his final moments, all became collector's items, displayed in museums or sold for astonishing prices. People traveled to the places he had once been, hoping to catch a glimpse of the past, to stand where he had stood, to walk the same streets he had walked. But perhaps the most telling sign of his lasting impact was that, even decades after his death, his name had never truly faded. Parents told their children stories of the outlaw who had defied the law. His name became shorthand for a certain kind of reckless daring, a man who had lived outside the rules and paid the price. In a world that had long since moved past the days of bank-robbing outlaws, his story remained, etched into American folklore, forever a legend of the 1930s. In the end, his story is one that continues to captivate, not just because of the crimes he committed, but because of what he represented. He was a product of his time, a time of desperation, struggle, and disillusionment. Whether seen as a ruthless outlaw or a rebellious folk hero, his legacy remains deeply embedded in American history. His life was a whirlwind of action, defiance, and narrow escapes, but it was also a reminder of the thin line between legend and reality. The media helped shape his image, the public fueled his myth, and law enforcement pursued him until the very end. And though he met his fate in a sudden, dramatic moment, his name never faded. Decades later, his story is still told, his legend still debated, and his life still studied as a symbol of an era when outlaws walked among us, and the chase between law and lawlessness played out in the public eye. He may have lived fast and died young, but in history, he remains immortal.